Thank you everyone for coming. So I'm going to be talking about my PhD thesis, which looked at managing multiple ecosystem services across urban landscapes and how we can manage them more effectively. So the structure of the talk, I'll start with a bit of a background to the problem, which involves the first chapter of my thesis, and then the three main research questions that I focused on, which were around one case study region, which was Brisbane, and then discuss the main findings and the recommendations from that. So first of all, what are ecosystem services? Ecosystem services are the benefits that ecosystems provide people. So that includes things like food, drinking water. It can even include things like non-material benefits like relaxation, exercise, even aesthetic appreciation. These are all things that we get from ecosystems that benefit both our physical and mental well-being. But ecosystems don't just provide a single ecosystem service. They provide multiple ecosystem services within one given location. And all of these ecosystem services are important to people. We need food as much as we need water, as much as we need exercise. So we need to manage ecosystems so they can provide multiple ecosystem services for our well-being. But this is difficult because you try to increase the provisioning of one ecosystem service, like say food production, by clearing land. You cause a decrease in another ecosystem service like carbon storage. So how do we manage multiple ecosystem services in a single ecosystem when we try to introduce an action which leads to decreases in others? Well, that's because there's relationships that exist among ecosystem services. And these come in the form of trade-offs and synergies. So you can increase, a trade-off is when you increase a single ecosystem service, say like food production, which causes a decrease in another ecosystem like service like carbon storage. And then you can have synergies between ecosystem services, where you increase one ecosystem service and that leads to an increase in another ecosystem service. For example, if you improve riparian vegetation along creek lines, that can improve flood mitigation, but it can also improve water quality regulation as well to ecosystem services. And these relationships among ecosystem services are driven by things that we call drivers. So drivers are changes to the ecosystem. For example, that can be the introduction of policies into an ecosystem, it can be changes in climate, it can be changes in the socio-economic situation of the region. All of these things can affect the type of ecosystem services an ecosystem can provide and whether there are trade-offs and synergies occurring between the services. For example, these are 4 different situations looking at the same ecosystem service, and there's 4 different relationships occurring between these same ecosystem services because there's different drivers present in the ecosystem. If we introduce an abandoned land reforestation policy, so where we reforest cropland that's been abandoned, we're going to increase carbon storage, but it's going to have no impact whatsoever on food production because we're not using that land for crop production anymore. So that means there is no relationship between food production and carbon storage. But if you introduce a different policy in a different situation, such as replacing cropland with forests in reforestation situation, you're increasing carbon storage, but that's directly causing a decrease in food production because you're decreasing agricultural land. So you now have a trade-off occurring between these 2 services. In the third situation, if you restore riparian vegetation, you're going to increase carbon storage because there's more trees. But because riparian zones aren't used for food production or agricultural, and trees help regulate water quality and fertilizer regulation, you're actually going to lead to an increase in food production as well. So in that situation, this driver is leading to a synergy between these 2 services. And finally, you can have urban expansion, which decreases area for both forests and for agriculture, leading to decreases in both of these services. And because the services are moving in the same direction, that is a synergy as well. So what we're basically showing in this picture is that in different situations, you can have different trade-offs and synergies occurring between the same ecosystem services. This suggests that introducing different management actions into an area, into an ecosystem, could potentially lead to trade-offs or it could lead to synergies. And so if we can identify which management actions lead to synergies occurring between ecosystem services, we can potentially increase the supply of multiple ecosystem services simultaneously, which is going to lead to more effective management. This is particularly, and so I had a look in the first chapter of my thesis about how many people actually look at these drivers, how many people look at what is causing trade-offs and synergies to occur between ecosystem services. So I looked at all of the literature that identified ecosystem trade-offs and synergies occurring between ecosystem services, and I looked at if these articles actually looked at what is driving these relationships to occur. And majority of these studies don't, basically. So the solid line are the ones that don't even mention, this is over time, sorry, so the number of percentage of articles against the number, the years. So the solid line shows that all the articles that don't even mention what is driving a trade-off or synergy to occur between the ecosystem services that it's assessing. The dotted line looks at the ones that implicitly identified what is causing the trade-off or synergy to occur between the ecosystem services. So when we mean implicit, we're talking about situations where, for example, like they notice that there is a policy in this environment and there's a trade-off occurring between two ecosystem services. But in this other area, the same policy is implemented, but there is also a trade-off occurring between ecosystem services. Therefore, they're assuming that that policy is causing a trade-off between the ecosystem services, but they don't actually look at explicitly how it's causing the relationship to occur. It's just correlated or associated with its present. That's what we mean by implicit. And then a small number of articles, if you look at the dashed line, explicitly identified the mechanistic pathways in which drivers are actually causing trade-offs and synergies to occur between ecosystem services. So from this we can show that not many assessments are actually looking at what is explicitly causing trade-offs and synergies to occur between ecosystem services. And this is an issue because if we don't know what is causing relationships to occur between ecosystem services, we can change an ecosystem and it can have massively catastrophic, perverse outcomes because we don't know what's going to happen. We could change a policy and suddenly one ecosystem service is declining rapidly, another one's increasing, but we didn't know that. If we understand what's driving it, we can better implement management. We also found that there was a bit of bias in the type of drivers people are identifying that are causing trade-offs or synergies to occur between ecosystem services. Not many people look at the cultural drivers of trade-offs and synergies between ecosystem services. For example, religion and cultural values. In some areas, there are particular materials found in ecosystems that are important for cultural or religious values that people source and that can affect the relationship between the ecosystem services. Socio-political things, even things like gender discrimination can affect relationships between ecosystem services. Most people are looking natural, physical and biological drivers that cause trade-off and synergies. So that's things like net primary productivity within it, precipitation, climate variability, that kind of thing. So this suggests that there is bias to what we're looking at that causes trade-offs and synergies, and we don't really focus a lot on what is the cultural, socioeconomic causes of ecosystem service relationships. But I was particularly interested in looking at what drives the supply of multiple ecosystem services within urban landscapes. So the urban population is growing increasingly over time to the point where I think we're over now over 50% of the world's population is living within urban areas, and that is going to keep growing over time as the population increases. And as more people move to urban areas, there is a more and more demand within urban areas for ecosystem services. All of these people moving or living in urban areas need access to green space for things like relaxation, exercise, carbon storage, air quality regulation, even air temperature regulation from the shade that the trees provide. Everyone needs access to these things within urban areas. And as the demand continues to grow, we need to better manage our urban green spaces so that can provide multiple ecosystem services. We need urban green spaces that can provide all of these ecosystem services. But how do we do that when we know that there are trade-offs and synergies occurring between these ecosystem services? If we try to implement management actions that increase one, we could lead to decreases in others. So I was interested in understanding which management strategies are going to promote synergies between these ecosystem services. Which management actions, if we implement them, are going to increase all of these ecosystem services instead of causing trade-offs. And so this is what I focused my thesis on. And I had three main questions that I wanted to answer around this. First one is, I wanted to understand more about urban cultural ecosystem services, but multiple services. So do the factors that affect where someone goes for what park someone goes for exercise, are they the same variable that affects where a person decides to go for relaxation? Does tree cover, for example, does tree cover affect where people go for relaxation, as well as exercise, as well as social interactions, which are all ecosystem services? And if they're different, why? Why do people prefer to go to one park for exercise, but not park B for exercise? What is it about park A that makes it better? If we understand that, we can implement actions that can better manage these services. The second question I wanted to answer was, how do different management strategies affect the provisioning of multiple ecosystem services? So if I looked at one management strategy within a park, does that management strategy promote synergies between multiple ecosystem services, or is it promoting trade-offs? And is this the same as a different management strategy? Are all management strategies the same, or do they implement the relationships between ecosystem services differently? And thirdly, I want to look at, can we spatially prioritise park management actions to reach targets for multiple ecosystem services? So we wanted a 20% increase in 3 different types of ecosystem services across urban parks. Where do we need to put management actions across the urban area to achieve that? So to answer these 3 questions, I looked at a single case study region, which was the Brisbane Public Green Space Network. So that's all the areas in the green. National parks were not included in the study because there are different regulations about what you can and cannot do in national parks, which affects the ecosystem services that you can use them for, so we left that alone. So I basically looked at all the ecosystem services within all of these parks across Brisbane. So for the first question, I looked at what parks in Brisbane are providing different cultural ecosystem services and why are they providing those services? What is it about them that makes them good for providing those services? So I looked at 4 different cultural ecosystem services across Brisbane. I looked at where people were going for social interactions, where people were going for exercise, relaxation, and where they're going for nature interactions. And then I identified a number of potential drivers that could affect where people choose to do each of these activities. And these include things like how far the park is from their home, the type of environmental characteristics of the park, the type of facilities present at the park, and even the socio-demographic characteristics of the people themselves. So like, how old are the people? What's their education level? What's their income level? All of these can affect where they go and what parks they go to and what they do within those parks. The next step was to work out where people are actually going. Which parks are people going to? So then I can further assess which of those drivers are affecting that. So I collected data on which parks people are visiting to receive these 4 cultural ecosystem services. And I did this by doing a Brisbane-wide survey, where we got people from all across Brisbane to participate in an online survey, where we asked them to go online, where they're presented with this Google Map interface, and we asked them to put pins on all of the parks across Brisbane that they've visited in the past 2 weeks and tell what activity they did within that park. And then we asked them some basic socio-demographic characteristic questions so we can get some information on that. And we also asked them if they wanted to provide their address so we could work out how far they were travelling to go to each of these parks. And this gave us all of the information that we needed on what parks were being used for across Brisbane. The next step was to collect information on the characteristics of the parks themselves so that we could begin to model the relationship of where people are going and the characteristics of the park themselves. So we collected information on tree cover, grass cover, and vegetation complexity, so foliage type diversity, using LiDAR satellite data, which was provided by Brisbane City Council. And we also collected information on all of the facilities present in all of Brisbane's parks, so every single bench, every single table, every single toilet block, every single playground. We collected all of the information on that, and that was provided by Brisbane City Council as well. Once we had all of that information, we began to model the relationship between where people are going and the socio-demographic characteristics of the people, the environmental characteristics of the park, and the facilities present at the park. So to do this, first of all, the results of the survey itself. We found that the majority of people are using parks for walking, and exercise ecosystem services. And we found that after that, supervising children, which was classified as social interaction, was also quite high. We also found there was some bias in our survey results, in that if you compare the results of our survey to the census data for Brisbane, we found that the people that were conducting our survey were much older than compared to the ABS average age, and we also found that their income was a lot higher and their education level was a lot higher. So there was some bias in our survey results, which is important to take in mind when you look at the results. So, okay, this is a bit scary. We began to model the where people are going. So we modelled the likelihood of someone visiting a park based on the characteristics of that park. And we created 8 different models for each ecosystem service, and then we identified which of those 8 models best explained why someone was visiting that park. So for exercise, we found that environmental characteristics, the facilities present at the park, the socio-demographic characteristics of the person, and the distance of the park from their home all explain the likelihood of someone visiting that park for exercise. And that was the same case for social interactions as well, the same characteristics. Whereas for nature interactions and relaxation, socio-demographic characteristics weren't coming up as important. Only the environmental characteristics of the park, facilities present at the park, and the distance of the park from the person's home. So, but they were all quite similar, like as you can see, environmental, distance from home, and socio-demographic characteristics, facility drivers, were all affecting all 4 cultural ecosystem services. If we unpack that a bit more and actually look at the coefficients of those best fit models. So here we have the coefficients from those 4 models that came out as best for each of the ecosystem services. So the colours denote which ecosystem service we're talking about. And these are for, and you can see over here, we only have exercise and social interactions for socio-demographic drivers, because that were the only models that were coming up as significant for socio-demographic characteristics. So explain these plots. If the dot is below the 0 line, it means that it is significantly impacting a person's likelihood of visiting the park. Having a negative impact on someone visiting the park. If the point is above the 0 line, it means that it's having a positive impact on someone visiting that park. And if the dot crosses the 0 line, it means that that variable is not significant. So I've made stars in all of the significant variables. So you can see that distance from home was significantly negative for all of the ecosystem services. So that means the further you go, the further the park is from someone's home, the less likely they're going to visit it for any of the ecosystem services, which is pretty, makes sense. The environmental characteristics, you can see that foliage height diversity, so that's the complexity of the vegetation present in the park, had a positive impact on both nature interactions and exercise. So the more complex the vegetation, the more likely someone's going to visit it from those nature interactions and exercise. Grass cover had a negative impact on social interactions, which was surprising. We also found that the shape of the park was positive, so that means the more linear the park becomes, the more likely someone is going to visit it for all 4 ecosystem services. And the more compact, the less likely they want to visit it. And of course, the larger the park, the more likely they'll visit it. And tree cover was actually negative for both social interactions and relaxation, and exercise. So as you reduce tree cover, the more likely someone's going to visit it for those activities. Facility drivers, all the significant ones were all positive. So the more facilities you have for the park, the more likely someone's going to visit it. The socio-demographic characteristics for the exercise and social interaction services weren't coming up as very significant. All which suggests that I don't think we were getting enough information on socio-demographic characteristics. I think there's a bit more of a relationship occurring there that wasn't picked up in our survey. But basically the only information we got from that was that men are less likely to go to parks for social interactions, and mature families, so people with children that are over the age of 16, are less likely to go to parks for social interactions as well. So from the results of this question, we show that not all cultural ecosystem services are influenced by the same variables. Socio-demographic characteristics are affecting exercise and social interactions and not the other services. But the park variables primarily are having the same kind of impact on the services. So tree cover was having a negative impact on all the services, which suggests that there's mainly synergies occurring between these ecosystem services. And the socio-demographic variables remain inclusive because I feel like we weren't capturing enough information in our survey, so I treat that with a grain of salt. The second question I was looking at was how do different park management strategies affect the provisioning of multiple ecosystem services? So do different park management strategies promote different relationships between the ecosystem services? Does one promote a trade-off or does one promote a synergy? So to look at this, I assessed how much each park provided all 5 of these ecosystem services: carbon storage, exercise, social interactions, nature interactions, and relaxation. And I looked at if the supply of each of these ecosystem services within each park changed either positively or negatively if under 3 different revegetation management strategies. So if we increase only the mid-story of pre-existing tree cover within Brisbane's parks, are all of these services increasing or decreasing, or are some increasing and some decreasing, suggesting trade-off or synergies to occur? What happens if we only increase tree cover with no impact on the lower canopy, lower vegetation strata? And what happens if we increase both tree cover and mid-story vegetation across Brisbane's parks? What happens to the supply of all of these services, and are they moving in the same direction or not? So these are basically, you don't have to read through this, these are the models that I used to predict the supply of each of the ecosystem services within each of Brisbane's parks. So carbon storage was calculated based on the vegetation present within the park, and the 4 cultural ecosystem services were calculated using the models that I developed in the previous chapter. And I looked at, and I basically changed the values for each of these variables within the models based on the scenario. So under scenario 1, where I was increasing the presence of mid-story vegetation by 30%, I basically increased the foliage height diversity variables within each of these models, recalculated the supply of the ecosystem services for that scenario. Same thing for tree cover, recalculated the supply of the services, and the same for scenario 3, which was a combination of increasing mid-story and tree cover. So first of all, this is the current supply of the 5 ecosystem services across Brisbane. So this is under the current conditions. So you can see that, unsurprisingly, Mount Coot-tha is providing most of the ecosystem services across Brisbane. But also the larger parks are providing a larger amount, which isn't surprising. And for the cultural ecosystem services, just as a reminder, that's measured in the number of park visits. So this one is number of park visits for social interactions, number of park visits for nature interactions, exercise and relaxation, just as a reminder. And this is what happens under each of those scenarios. So this is the proportional change in the supply of the ecosystem services based on the current level of the ecosystem services. So if it's red, it means that it's increasing by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6%. And if it's blue, that means it's increasing from the current condition, under the current conditions. So under scenario 1, which was a 30% increase in mid-story vegetation, you can see that carbon storage was increasing, but only slightly, as it's a lighter blue. And for the cultural ecosystem services, it was a mix. Some of the parks are increasing and some weren't, based on the characteristics of those parks. Under scenario 2 and 3, you can see that there was a much bigger change happening. Carbon storage, unsurprisingly, was increasing quite rapidly, but exercise actually decreased. And particularly for relaxation and social interactions, it decreased by a lot. And so you can see by looking at this that there are trade-offs and synergies occurring. Increase just tree cover, that's going to be great for carbon storage, definitely. But it's not going to be so great for some of the cultural ecosystem services, which suggests we have a trade-off on our hands. We try to induce this management action, we're going to lead to a trade-off. But in the first scenario, if we introduce a 30% increase in mid-story vegetation, we're not actually going to see any trade-off or synergies occurring because the ecosystem services are only increasing or decreasing by a minuscule amount, which suggests there isn't much of a relationship occurring between the ecosystem services under this management strategy. Whereas under scenarios 2 and 3, there are larger trade-off or synergies occurring. So from this, we can tell you have winners and losers in each strategy. We can implement scenario management action 1, where we increase mid-story vegetation by 30%. We're not going to see any trade-off or synergies occurring, but we're not going to see an increase in any ecosystem services anyway. So it's kind of a defunct strategy. But if we introduce one of the others, which involved increasing tree cover, we're going to increase one service, but we're also going to decrease some of the other services as well. So we need to be mindful when we're implementing management strategies for parks. We need to understand what are going to be the implications of introducing that, because it may be great for one service but not so great for another. So you need to know what are the services you want to increase before you decide on the management strategy that you're going to implement into that park. The final question was, can we spatially prioritise park management actions to reach targets for multiple ecosystem services? So we want to increase 3 different ecosystem services by 20% across Brisbane. How do we do that? What parks should we be targeting? So I actually worked with Jeff on this one, using Prioritiser. So basically we looked at spatially allocating management actions to achieve target increases in, again, those 5 ecosystem services: exercise, nature interactions, relaxation, social interactions, and carbon storage. So if we want to increase all of these ecosystem services across Brisbane by a specific target, what parks should we be focusing our management actions on, and what management actions do we need to implement? So we looked at this under 2 different scenarios. So we looked at what happens if we want to increase these ecosystem services, but we don't care where across Brisbane we increase them. So if we increase all of these ecosystems services by 20%, it could be all in this area in the south of the river. We don't care where it is. And we looked at the other scenario where we do care whether we are increasing these ecosystem services. And so we actually made sure that in each of these red SA3 zones, that each of the ecosystem services were increasing by the same amount, so that everyone had equitable access to each of these ecosystem services. And we looked at the differences occurring when we did those 2 different scenarios. So and then we identified 8 different management actions we could implement in each of Brisbane's parks to achieve an increase in the ecosystem services. So this includes things like replacing grass cover with tree cover, replacing tree cover with grass cover, and adding a variety of different facilities like playgrounds, adding barbecues, park benches, or doing absolutely nothing to that park and just leaving it as it is. Or and then management actions 7 and 8 are a combination of, management action 7 is a combination of management actions 1, 3, 4, and 5. And management action 8 is a combination of management action 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we also calculated the cost of each of these management actions for each park. And then the next step was to actually put this into Prioritiser and to spatially work out which parks. So then we calculated the supply of each of these ecosystem services in each park within Brisbane under each of these different management actions. So we know how much each ecosystem service would increase by under each of these management actions within each park. And we also calculated the cost for each park of implementing each of these management actions. We then put this data into Prioritiser and ran a variety and worked out how much we could increase each of the ecosystem services by. Like, could we increase all 5 ecosystem services by 20% across Brisbane? And if so, which parks are going to be allocated which management action under each of those scenarios? So this is the spatial prioritisation under the non-equitable scenario. So this is where we don't care where the ecosystem services are increasing by. Each colour identifies the different management actions that are being allocated to each of Brisbane's parks, and these are the different targets that are being achieved. So if we don't have a target for carbon storage, so a 0% target, we don't care if carbon's increasing or decreasing, but we want to increase all 4 of those cultural ecosystem services by 101%. These are the management actions we need to implement across Brisbane and where we need to implement them. So you can see that a lot of the parks are being allocated management action 7, which is replacing grass cover with tree cover and adding all of the facilities that you can to that park. But if we want to increase carbon storage by 13%, which was the maximum amount that we could increase carbon storage by within Brisbane, you can see that suddenly there's a lot more green coming up, which is management action 1, which is replacing grass cover with tree cover and doing nothing else. And so, I should probably bear in mind that we did this at minimum cost. So we told Prioritiser, how do we achieve each of these targets but at a minimum cost? So this is why you're getting a lot more green here, because this management action, you're replacing grass cover with tree cover. You're also doing that in management action 7, but management action 7 is a lot more expensive. So that's why we're allocating management action 1 here. And if we want to increase carbon storage and the cultural services, both, so carbon storage by 13% and the cultural services by 93%, you can see that again, management action 7 is coming up again, because you're replacing grass with trees, so it's going to increase carbon storage, but you're also increasing all of the facilities, which is going to benefit the cultural ecosystem services. But then this changes. So this is under the non-equitable scenario, where we don't care where we're increasing the services, but if we do care about evenly distributing these increases, it actually changes by quite a bit. So this is where we try to evenly distribute the increases in the ecosystem services across Brisbane. First of all, we realised that by doing this, we can achieve a lot less. So we can only increase carbon storage by 1% if we want to evenly distribute the increases. And cultural services can only be increased by 42% across Brisbane. And you can see that a lot more coming up. So still there's a lot more green if you're trying to increase carbon storage. And there's still management action 7 is still coming up a lot. But there's also a lot more variation in some of the others coming up. We also found that this was a lot more expensive. So we know the cost for each of these management actions within each park, and we know that trying to achieve these targets, which were a lot lower than the other one, were actually more expensive as well. So from this, we found that strategies that involve multiple actions, so increasing tree cover as well as adding facilities, are much more capable of increasing multiple ecosystem services, but they are a lot more expensive and not always feasible. Spatially prioritising the management actions of parks can help manage costs and achieve targets effectively. So by spatially prioritising, we have a better idea of how much it's going to cost us, and we can more effectively achieve specific targets, like a 20% increase, if we know where we need to do it. And we also found that ensuring social equity in access, so evenly distributing increases in ecosystem services across Brisbane, increases costs and also reduces the targets that are achievable. So if you want to achieve equity, it will cost you. So the main findings of this thesis altogether was that Brisbane's parks provide multiple ecosystem services, and that the characteristics of the parks have quite a big impact on the type of ecosystem services they can provide. So the characteristics such as tree cover and the facilities present all affect why a person decides to go to that park to get an ecosystem service. Park management strategies can promote either synergies or trade-offs among ecosystem services. So it's important to understand before you implement a park management strategy how it's going to affect multiple ecosystem services within that park. And spatially prioritising park management actions across Brisbane could be an effective way of increasing ecosystem services across Brisbane at minimum cost. So from this, I actually did this talk at Brisbane City Council, which is why I have this slide here. The main recommendations are we need to carefully consider how management strategies are going to affect multiple ecosystem services before we implement them. We need to understand what ecosystem services are we interested in, and how each of these management strategies affect those ecosystem services before we implement it. To increase recreation use and carbon storage within Brisbane parks, will require strategic prioritisation of park management actions. So we want to increase these ecosystem services. We need to be strategic about how to spatially prioritise management actions across Brisbane to achieve that. And increasing tree cover within parks is likely to increase multiple ecosystem services, but it's also going to decrease them as well. So tree cover is a difficult one that requires a lot more research about how it's affecting the ecosystem services. So that's some future research. And thank you. That's it.
Questions? I have a question.
Yeah.
How responsive was the council to your suggestions? Like, was it what they expected to find, or was there anything in your work they sort of weren't expecting?
They were really interested in the spatial prioritisation. They loved it, and they were really interested in that. I think they were particularly interested in the impacts of tree cover because that's something that they are very interested in, is how tree cover affects how people are using parks and what's the optimal percentage or proportion of tree cover across Brisbane parks that's going to maximise use of parks. But I think they were really happy with it because a lot of the data that I used for this project actually came from Brisbane City Council. I think they were just happy that it was being used for something and it was actually useful, their data, so I think they were actually quite excited about that. But no, it was really positive feedback from them, yeah. Colour.
I just have a quick question about the shape of the park. And I was just wondering, the river defines a lot of Brisbane. I'm guessing there are a lot of linear parks along the river. So did you notice, just by looking at the shape of parks, were a lot of the linear parks along the river? So maybe that was what was bringing people into those parks?
Yeah, that's true, that the fact that they're next to the river could affect it. We also think that the reason the linear parks were more having a positive impact was because a lot of them are cycleways, so that they're the only parks that people can really cycle through. And also, linear parks actually have a higher, higher exposure. So a linear park means that there are more people that have easier access to that park. Whereas you have a really compact park, there's less people less houses surrounding it, so that more people have to travel further to get to that park. Whereas a linear park, there's more people, it's got more surface area, so that more people have access to it, which is why we think linear parks were coming up. But yeah, the fact that it's next to a river could also be affecting it as well.
Yeah, I wonder if you'd see the same, or how different results would be in a different city that doesn't have a river.
Yeah, I would love to do this in a different city and to see how it was affecting, because I think, Brisbane has a lot of green space cover compared to most cities. So it'd be interesting to look at different cities that have more compact parks. Like you look at New York, you've got Central Park. How does that affect how people are using those parks? Are people willing to travel further for that? Whereas in Brisbane, people don't want to travel as far. So yeah, I think that would be interesting, yeah.
So which of your scenarios would you recommend as the best in terms of minimizing trade-offs and?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. Because we only looked at increasing tree. Are you talking about increasing tree cover in the midst of revegetation? Yeah, it's tricky because tree cover was it's a complicated one because you can't increase carbon storage without increasing tree cover. It's impossible. But it's going to have a negative impact on the cultural services. But what we realised from that final chapter where we were looking at different actions adding facilities, you can increase tree cover as long as you add facilities. If you have a management strategy around combining all of those actions, you can potentially increase all of the ecosystem services. So I think increasing tree cover, yes, but I think up to a certain degree. I think there's a lot of studies have looked at, particularly Daniel Shanahan with Rich Fuller, have looked at what's the optimal percentage of tree cover within Brisbane's parks, and they found that it was about 30 to 40%. Go above that and people don't really want to go there for exercise anymore. If you go below that, it's too much sun, people don't want to go there. And also, I think it'd be interesting to look at management strategies that look at how clumpy the tree cover is within the parks. So I think if the tree covers all clumped together, does that affect people's choice, or do people prefer more sparsely patchy vegetation? But I would recommend tree cover, but I think we just need to do a bit more research into how to design the tree cover across the park to optimise it, but yeah. Yes.
Does Brisbane City Council have any information on the quality of the facilities that they have within the parks?
Not that they gave me. No, but that's a good point. I was wondering that when I was looking at public toilet facilities and things like that.
Yeah, in terms of playgrounds, if you're looking at minimum cost, if you put a minimum cost playground in a park, is that going to have the same impact as if you gone above minimum cost?
Yeah, so in the scenario where we had like the playgrounds, we were given a list of all the different playgrounds that you could possibly put in a park, and so there's a lot. So we chose like the most kind of middle range playground that you could have, so not like, excuse my language, the shittest playground you could have, but not the best either. We did like a mid-level one, because there's different costs associated with each of those playgrounds as well. So yeah, I'm not too sure about that one, about how that would change. Yeah.
How much tree cover is there within parks in Brisbane compared to people's backyards? Do you have any?
I'm not too sure actually, no. I think Rich Fuller did some research on that, but I can't quite remember what it is. But I do know that Brisbane City Council are trying to increase their tree cover to, I think it's like, they want to increase tree cover across Brisbane to about 60% or something by the year 2040, 2050. So Brisbane has really high tree cover compared to other cities. The fact that the case with a lot of Australian cities, because we're quite a sprawling city and a lot of people have backyards, it increases a lot of people who have tree cover. And that's another thing that's probably affecting these results, is that people with backyards may affect whether they're going to parks or not. And that makes it a very specific situation in Brisbane where a lot of people do have backyards. And that's probably affecting that as well. Yeah.
Probably work that out if you knew people's addresses.
Yeah, there may be some ethics around
Just
that.
some ethics.
Stopping people's backyards. Yeah.
I was just going to ask about the social equity thing, because it's not a great result that if we want to meet these sort of the environmental targets anyway, that only a certain amount of people will benefit from it. It will be specific. So I was wondering if you could maybe take in public transport or just road access and stuff, so that you could potentially, if you had to put your money towards certain ones and you know that other people aren't going to benefit from it, you can put a little bit of money towards that, so you're not.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Looking at public transport, we haven't looked at public transport. We did do like, when we looked at distance from like parks to people's homes, we did do network analysis to work out like the roads that people would travel through to get there. But in this analysis, we just assumed that people were walking to the parks, that like a lot of people are going to drive there. But previous studies have shown that people don't really people do drive to parks, but they don't do it on a regular basis. On a regular basis, they would prefer to walk to the nearest park because it's just more convenient for them. But it would be good to look at the actual access to the parks. I mean, Brisbane City Council wants to look at things like bus stops next to the parks and how that affects how the parks are being used, and also the amount of parking bays available at the parks. So I think that's a good next step.